Okay, so there's an identity for sine squared of x, which is 1 minus cosine squared of x. So all I did was just replace this right here with its identity, which is 1 minus cosine squared of x. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute not only this 2, but it's also a negative 2, so I'm going to distribute it. So I'll now have cosine squared of x is equal to 1. What's the negative 2 times 1? Negative 2. And what's the negative 2 times a negative cosine squared of x? So that'll be a positive 2 cosine squared of x. Next thing that we should do, let's go ahead and combine this 1 and this minus 2. So we have cosine squared of x (1 minus 2) is negative 1 plus 2 cosine squared of x. Okay, so this kind of looks like something in algebra where you would say, I'll show you the algebra part. If it were an algebra question, it would be something like x squared is equal to negative 1 plus 2x squared. You got to combine like terms by getting the x squares to one side. So we would say minus 2x squared minus 2x squared. And over here, this would cancel. Here, even though you don't see it, but it has a coefficient of 1, so really you have 1 minus 2, which is negative 1, and then you keep the x squared, so you have negative 1x squared is equal to negative 1. And then how do you get x squared by itself? You're going to divide by negative 1 on both sides, and you get x squared is equal to positive 1, and then you know what to do. You take the square root, so you get x is equal to plus or minus 1. That's exactly what we're going to do here, only with trig. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to subtract 2 cosine squared of x on both sides. Of course, this right here cancels. Right here, even though you don't see it, it has a coefficient of 1, so we have 1 minus 2, which is negative 1, and then we keep the cosine squared of x, just like what we did in the algebra problem, is equal to negative 1. Then what did we do? We divided by a negative 1. So we get cosine squared of x, I'm going to continue right here, cosine squared of x is equal to 1. Finally, we take the square root, so we get that the cosine of x is equal to plus or minus 1. Cosine of x is equal to plus or minus 1. Okay, of course we just need to get x, so we're going to need to get rid of that cosine, so we're going to have to inverse both sides. I think from here it gets pretty easy. Inverse both sides. I'm going to go ahead and move on to a new notepad. So what happens here is that my arc cosine and my cosine cancels out, leaving me with just x. So we have x is equal to arc or inverse cosine of 1. Okay, so then basically, or actually, sorry, plus or minus, I forgot my plus or minus 1. All right, so this is basically saying go to your unit circle, and where on your unit circle is your x coordinate, because it's cosine, x coordinate positive 1, or where is it negative 1? So let's see. Where's my unit circle? Here's my unit circle. Where is my x positive 1? I have one here at 0. So at 0. I also have one x. Where is x? Where is x? Right here at pi. Where else? Where else? Where else? And then back here at 2 pi. Okay, so we're done with that. And if you realize number 3 also doesn't have an interval from 0 to 2 pi. So we're going to have to say plus 2 pi n, where n is equal to 0 plus or minus 1 plus or minus 2 dot dot dot. Realize you have 3 equations here. Your first equation is going to read 0 plus 2 pi n. Your next equation is going to be pi plus 2 pi n. And then your next equation is going to be 2 pi plus 2 pi n. But this is the shorthand way that we can say or state it. And of course, where n is equal to 0 plus or minus 1 plus or minus 2 dot dot dot. Let me write that down right quick. All right, now moving on to number 7. All right, so number 7 says cosine squared of x is equal to cosine of x plus 6. Okay, this is similar to an algebra problem that would say something like x squared, right? X being my cosine, and then I'm going to square it, is equal to x. So this would be x, again, my cosine, plus 6. Now in algebra, your teacher would say, move everything to one side. So I'm going to move this to one side and this to the other side. Now this x is positive at the moment. When I move it to the other side, it becomes what? Negative. Likewise, this 6 is positive at the moment. When I move it to the other side, it'll become negative. So I will have x squared minus x minus 6 is equal to 0. Well, let's go ahead and do that over here. I'm going to move this to the other side and move this to the other side. And they're both positive here, so that when I move them to the other side, they will become negative. So I have cosine squared of x minus cosine of x minus 6 is equal to 0. Okay, let's go back to algebra. You did an example like this yesterday, where we can go ahead and factor it out. That goes from you knowing the quadratic equation, trial and error, the box method, the t-table, whatever your teacher from Algebra 2 taught you. We'll get x and x, a multiple of 6 that will give me 1, and that will be 3 and 2. But I'm trying to get a negative 1, so that will be a negative 3 plus 2. Negative 3 plus 2 is a negative 1, and a negative 3 times 2 is a negative 6, which is right here. Alright, well that's exactly what we're going to do here. So I'm going to say, and you kind of have already done it, because remember, what did we say, what did you hear me say x was? When I went from trig to regular algebra problem, we said that x was our just cosine of x. So that's exactly what I'm going to replace x with. I'm going to say cosine of x. Then, don't forget your minus 3. And then you have cosine of x plus 2. Okay, so if you were to FOIL this out, you would get this right here that's in purple. Cosine squared of x. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared of x. Cosine times a positive 2 is 2 cosine of x. Minus 3 cosine of x will give me a negative cosine of x. And then negative 3 times 2 is a negative 6. So we did factor correctly. Remember, if you have to change it to algebra, go ahead and work it out the algebra way, and then just follow that process and apply it to the trig equation. Okay? So now, what would you do here? You would take, in algebra, you would take each of these, so x minus 3 is equal to 0, and you get x equals 3. Here, you would say x plus 2 is equal to 0, and you get x equals negative 2. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. So we're going to say cosine of x minus 3 is equal to 0. So in other words, cosine of x is equal to 3. Then we get cosine of x plus 2 is equal to 0. And we get cosine of x is equal to negative 2. Okay, so then that's something that you're used to doing now. So we're going to arc cosine both. So I'm going to try to squeeze it in here. So I'm going to arc cosine or inverse cosine. What happens here? All of this cancels, leaving you with x is equal to inverse cosine of 3. And here I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to inverse cosine. Whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. So I'm going to okay, so what happens here? Cancels, leaving you with x is equal to inverse cosine of negative 2. Alright, so let's do with this one here, in the dark red or in the maroon. Where on your unit circle is your x coordinate 3? So let's go to our unit circle. Where is our x coordinate 3? It happens nowhere. Even if you were to type this in your calculator, you would get a no solution, because that's why it's called a unit circle. It only goes up, down, left, or right, only one. Either negative 1, positive 1, left and right, negative 1, positive 1, up and down. So this one is a no solution right here. And if we do this one right here, inverse cosine of negative 2, where on your unit circle is your x coordinate? Negative 2. And you're going to notice that if you look at your unit circle, it's the same thing. No solution, because there is no negative 2 value.